Hello and welcome now. As we come to the conclusion of this very special week, which is known as Holy Week, and the conclusion of these last 3 days, which are known as the Sacred Triduum. I'm not sure when you will exactly be watching this, but if you are, remember that the Triduum runs from the meal on Holy Thursday evening through the prayer service of Good Friday and concludes with the new meal, the Easter meal, the Easter celebration at the Vigil. So, with that in mind, we're going to talk today a little bit about the fact that there are two sets of readings that are enhancing our Easter time. One set of readings is used in the Easter Vigil, which, by the way, is the major Easter celebration. And in earlier times, because the celebration took place on the Vigil, which is the pre-day before Easter Sunday, that was the only Mass that was celebrated. This was the great Easter Mass, okay? So that perhaps is interesting to note. However, as time went on, and many Catholics, many Christians, for various reasons, did not take part of the Easter Vigil, a set of readings, celebrations took place on Easter Day, in the daylight. And so there's a set of readings for that. All right, so let me begin by saying, what are the readings for the Easter Vigil? Well, there are a number of Old Testament readings that are used at that celebration. I won't go into all of those because unless you're there, you probably wouldn't enjoy them. But the epistle letter for the Vigil is from Romans 6, verses 3 through 11. And then the Gospel, which is celebrated with great joy on the feast of Easter, the Easter Vigil, comes from Luke chapter 24, verses 1 through 12. All right, so those would be the Easter readings for, or coming from, or derived from the Easter Vigil. For Easter Day itself, here are the readings that are assigned. The first is from Acts of the Apostles, chapter 10, verses 34a, and then verses 37 through 43. The second reading is from Paul's letter to the Colossians, chapter 3, verses 3 and 4, or there are as an alternative reading, could come from Paul's letter to the Corinthians, chapter 5, verse 6b through 8. All right, so you have your choice there. And then the gospel comes from that of John, chapter 20, verses 1 through 9. All right, so you see the variety here. And since we have been looking at the tradition of Luke, this is the year of Luke, and we saw last time that the Passion narrative came from Luke, it might be an appropriate way to start this time by looking at how Luke presents the resurrection story. In fact, Luke, who has a lot to say, as we saw with regard to the Passion narrative, also has more material with regard to the resurrection of Jesus than any of the other gospel writers either. So let me throw that out. Now, it pictures, and of course there's a great similarity, in fact, between Matthew and Mark and even John, that when the women come to the tomb where Jesus had been buried, they find that the stone has been rolled away. Now we'll see in Matthew he has a little dramatization about how that happens, but that's not the case in Luke. In fact, when the women come, because, and here again, keep in mind, Luke has very carefully pointed out that the women stood faithful when Jesus died on the cross, 3 women, that they noticed where Jesus was buried, they noticed the tomb, and now these 3 come on the first day of the week when the sun is in the process of rising. Why do they come? Because from the Lucan tradition, which kind of follows the pattern of Matthew and Mark, they come to carry out the the burial rites that were not done for Jesus when he was buried. In other words, that's why they come bringing spices to carry out the tradition of what went on when someone died and was and the burial ritual took place. Now, who are the women who come? Well, in Luke's account, the women were Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary, the mother of James. Now, we're not quite sure who this mother of James was. Some say, later on in the gospel story, the leadership of the community in Jerusalem after Jesus had risen was a man named James. There was some indication that this James was a relative of Jesus and his family. Now, exactly what that relationship as relative was, again, is not clear, and various different opinions are given. Some would make him even a brother of Jesus, that is, you remember, the theory being that when Mary married Joseph, he had already had some family. Well, we don't know, okay? But all of that is part of a tradition, a lore that grows up, and I leave that for your imagination. But it is said in the Acts of the Apostle, and keep in mind that, again, Luke is responsible for the material found in Acts, that James was the leadership of the community there. So is that who this is, the mother of this James? Now, they come to complete the burial rites. When they come, the stone is rolled back. They notice that the body is not there, and they go in to see. All right? So this is Luke's way of presenting it. It's different in the other 2 synoptics, and it's different in John's gospel, so which we will look at a little bit in a few minutes. So when they go in, they are puzzling over how did the tomb become empty. And apparently now, it's not clear whether they're standing still in the tomb itself or whether they're outside of it, but 2 men stood by them. And they are pictured as having shimmering clothing, okay? Now, this is, so therefore, we don't identify who these 2 witnesses are that speak now to the women. Some would see them as angels. And here's where, again, there's a lot of kind of addition and understanding that goes around the resurrection story. These men shimmering in white garments that catch the imagination of the women may well be representative of something that happened when Jesus, you remember, on the mountain was transfigured. This suggests a connection between this event now and the transfiguration, when Moses and Elijah, you remember, were pictured as speaking to Jesus and talking about what would happen to him when he came to Jerusalem. So is this now the fulfillment in Jerusalem of what Elijah and Moses had been discussing with Jesus. So, are these men or are these angels? And of course, their question is, well, you remember what Jesus said, and in a certain way, the witnesses here rebuke the women for not knowing, but keep in mind, and this is that the disciples are, and Mary and the women, are to remember what Jesus had said. Now, we may have noticed on other occasions that the word remember or remembrance here has a unique sense of meaning. It translated means to bring to mind, to create a form of presence. And in the Hebrew language, there is the word zikron, which is used when Jesus is pictured as fulfilling the mission that he had been assigned on. But zikron means that when one, this might be the way to do it, remembers something about Jesus, that it is, and here's the meaning of that word, it is as if this is happening for the first time. So although certainly the news that Jesus is raised, is not in the tomb, indicates a presence here. Now, there is no commitment given to the women here to go and tell anybody what has happened. So again, this is going to be a unique characteristic of the Lucan tradition. The women here, in a certain way, act in the same way, and here's the connection, that the shepherds did when the announcement of Jesus' birth had been made. You remember that they had glory to God in the highest, and that they had been encountered by a heavenly vision, and the shepherds had gone over to to Bethlehem, had seen Jesus, and then they themselves had told others what had happened. Now, here, the women may tell others the good news that Jesus is raised, but they are not commissioned to do so. In a certain way, they are doing it because it is the natural expression of something joyful to do this. So they are pictured as going back to where the 11 are. Luke is very careful to point out that one of the disciples, of course, had left Jesus. So they go back and report to the 11 and the phrase, all the rest. So who else was gathered in the upper room there waiting for things to happen? We don't know. And so here, in a certain way, could be a large number of people, could be just a few. So that's what happens in the Lucan tradition. As we pointed out, everything here in this gospel connected with the resurrection happens in Jerusalem. And from the viewpoint of Luke, all the events connected with Jesus' resurrection happen on the same day. Now, there are other aspects of this. There will be a story where two disciples go down from Jerusalem to Emmaus. Jesus will talk with them. That's another resurrection story. In fact, it turns out to be the longest of the resurrection stories. All right, so that's a little bit of a background to the Lucan story. The women are the witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus. Messengers, again, who are these two men or two angels? And two, of course, always is part of the Lucan understanding that two kind of verify the truth of something. They are two witnesses. Don't we even use that today? Because one person might say something, you have only their word to take for it. But if you have two and they say the same thing, well, the truth of that statement would certainly be most likely clearer. All right. So all of this is a little background here for the Lucan account. The women receive the good news, they share it, they act in the same way as I mentioned, the shepherd. The women were the traditional women, as we mentioned, Magdalene, Mary, Joanna, and Mary, the mother of James. Now, those of you who pay very close attention to this will notice that only in Luke is Joanna mentioned, okay? So when you look at the women in the other stories, she's not mentioned. We don't have explanation as to why some of this takes place and where the background or information that was given to the gospel writer came from, okay? But I smile a little if you want the Jeopardy answer. Where does Joanna appear in the resurrection stories? Which gospel it is that here according to Luke? Now, it is also true that there is, and we're going to look next at the story recorded in John, a sign for Easter Sunday, but it is also true that, although not terribly publicized, that this gospel tradition according to Luke could also be used on Easter Sunday, since it is the official Easter Mass, that is the one celebrated on the Vigil, transferred to Sunday morning would make some sense. So I'm not sure which of these you will hear when you celebrate, but if you follow the tradition for the Sunday, then it is from John. Now, in John's Gospel, Mary Magdalene is introduced as coming to the grave of Jesus very early in the morning, before the sun had arose, the first day of the week, the first day after the Sabbath. There's a great deal of emphasis. John likes to use symbolism here, and the fact that this is the first day also could have the idea of the new day or the 8th day. You can't add another day to the calendar as we have it, but in the religious understanding, this new day is the 8th day. And it marks the beginning of a new creation. So keep in mind that in the scriptural tradition, God began by creating the world and creating a garden. And so we will see in this gospel that Jesus is buried in a garden. All right? So obviously, John wants to connect the old first beginning of creation with the new creation that is taking place. All right, so Mary Magdalene comes. Now, Mary Magdalene is coming to the tomb. Why? She is obviously not coming to prepare or to carry out the burial ritual, because that was already done. Now we have to go back in John's Gospel to the fact that when Jesus died, he was taken down from the cross, and that a man named Joseph of Arimathea, a very wealthy man, and therefore that would explain why he was buried in a tomb. I think we've noticed on other occasions, men who were crucified were not placed in nice tombs. They were simply thrown in common ditches. And when the number of kind of dead men multiplied enough, they would be just simply buried over. So the fact that Jesus is here when he is taken down from the cross, placed according to the permission given by Pilate to Joseph of Arimathea, placed in a new structured tomb in a garden that had no one in it before. Now, all of that you can begin to see the creation of a new time mirroring the creation of the world in the beginning. So why Mary comes to the tomb is anyone's guess, but we assume that she came out of sorrow, that because Jesus had died and was appropriately buried, she came to the tomb simply as maybe some people even today do to the place where their loved ones have been buried, to say a prayer or to meditate, all right? Now, in the gospel tradition of John, which we will be listening to, and by the way, part 1 is this week, part 2 is next week. So let me just give the connection. There are really 2 scenes here that take place in this story. The first scene is the garden tomb. When does it happen? On the first day of the week. What are the verses here, as I mentioned? Chapter 20, verses 1 through 10. Mary Magdalene comes, although this is not included, but nevertheless, let's look at this. Mary Magdalene comes, and her story is found in verses 11 through 18. That's scene 1. Scene 2, which is the household scene, takes place, this is verses 19 through 25, takes place that evening, the evening of the resurrection. And then there's a second part that says a week later, the disciples were still gathered in this upper room. Now that part will be the gospel for next time. All right, so kind of looking at the way in which it's broken up, give this kind of development here, okay? So, Mary comes to the tomb, notices that the stone is rolled away, and goes then to report to the disciples, wherever they are gathered. We keep in mind this household room, okay? And announces that the stone has been rolled away, and now she has not gone into the tomb. So we're not quite sure just what Mary's position had been before she runs to tell the news that the stone has been rolled away. At this point, Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved go to the tomb. Now they are pictured as running, okay? I'm not quite sure what the implication of running is, but perhaps they were kind of quick to do this. The disciple whom Jesus loved, or known as the beloved disciple, reaches the tomb before Peter. In other words, he apparently has been going to the gym the more often. Well, anyway, he's the faster runner, and he gets to the tomb, but he does not go in. He waits for Peter. Peter then goes into the tomb, and the other disciple, also goes in. And as he does this, comes to believe. Now, this, of course, is key to the Johannine thinking, all right? Now, what do they notice when they enter into the tomb? They notice that the burial cloths are nicely rolled up. One at the head where the body had laid, and one at the feet. Probably the place where a body was placed in this kind of tomb would be on kind of a platform, and the body would rest there for a period of time. And then after a period of time, the bodies were placed. Usually these tombs had little slots in them in which the deceased remains were placed. Now, this was very early after the execution of Jesus, and so that obviously had not yet taken place. So the disciple whom Jesus loves, when he steps into the tomb, comes to believe. Now, what is interesting here is that in this gospel, which is known also as the gospel of the signs that Jesus performs, remember there are 7 signs, we call them miracles, and he recognizes that by this, that Jesus has been risen. Now, what is the importance about the way in which the burial cloths had been laid? Well, remember, again, going back to when Lazarus had been called out of the tomb by Jesus, he had come enshrouded with all of the burial cloths on, and Jesus had said to them, unbind him, let him go, okay? So in this case, Jesus has been not only unbounded, but carefully setting aside the burial cloths, which indicates here that something different has taken place. Now, John's Gospel often likes to, as we've seen, refer back to the tradition. You remember when Moses was in the meeting tent with God, that he would go into the tent and spoke with God, but when he came out to meet the people, his face was so white, or so enlivened, that he had to wear a veil. All right, so during his lifetime, the divine glory needed to be shielded when Moses was with people. Now the veil of Jesus' mortal flesh is no longer needed. So there's this kind of reference to the resurrection. Jesus lives in and experiences the glory of God. All right, just to quickly move on, as the disciples leave, having had this experience, Mary of Magdala stays behind. She's left alone in the garden and is pictured as weeping. She looks into the tomb and sees 2 angels, one at either end of the place where the wrappings had been. Perhaps this represents a little bit, you remember that when the Ark of the Covenant had been established, there were 2 angels, one on either end of the Ark. And so there's a symbolism here. The golden cherubim had been established in the days of Moses and onward. All right? Mary turns around, having met these or seen these 2 angels, and they're pictured as angels here, sees a man whom she considers to be the gardener, says, really accusingly, "What have you done with him?" Accuses him of being a grave robber. And it says, "Wherever you put him, I will come and take his body." With that, Jesus says to her, "Mary." And she turns and says, "Rabboni." And this is the first meeting of anyone in John's Gospel with the risen Lord. Apparently, she reaches out. Jesus says, "Do not touch me, for I have not yet ascended to my God and to your God." And so, as the Johannine tradition sees the ascension as really happening on Easter Sunday, and we'll pick that up again next time when we come to the evening story here. We're not quite sure what follows here from Mary's action of praising Jesus or recognizing Jesus, but she is therefore the first witness. And she goes back and says to the disciples, perhaps the words that, 5 words that are most important, "I have seen the Lord." So she is the first to witness to the resurrection of Jesus. Now this part of chapter 20 is not told this time, will be the gospel for coming up next during Easter week. But I tell it because, and it's important to notice the setting for this, as we've mentioned before, that it's in a garden, that in the garden the story of creation had begun. There had been infidelity, unfortunately, took place in the garden. Now in the new garden, there is fidelity. The risen Jesus is with us, is with Mary, and she is his witness. And so as we come now to the celebration, understand that there's much material about the resurrection which is not clear. There is a lot of kind of variation. And I hope in this discussion a little bit we have pointed some of the differences, particularly between Luke and John, in the way in which they have presented the resurrection. However that is, may this be certainly a day and a time to rejoice with a great Alleluia to the Lord risen. Thank you for being with us, and hope to see you again.